got very good arms.
He didn't fall? Inconceivable. You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes, and I know a lot of people are missing Gevian Dargan on the channel. We've been trying to get him on, and he's had some plans, but we've been working on this little project that we're going to be doing, hopefully weekly. It's called It's Complicated. It's where Gevian comes onto the channel, and we try not to get ourselves in trouble by talking about some of the more dangerous topics out there, things that can get you in trouble, that are hot button issues. Gevian is the only one that really wants to tackle these fires with me. I do appreciate it. How you doing, Gevian?
I'm doing well, Wes, but I thought the idea was as much as possible try to see if we can get me banned from YouTube forever by asking some of these questions.
Hopefully
I'm glad you're thinking about it. Yeah.
So
but I
today,
enjoy having these kind of talks with you.
We're going to dive right into some hot button issues. We're going to talk about, comic book writers is what we're specifically looking at here. Those are the kind of the demographics I was able to find. We'll get into the demographics, but we're going to talk about, people of color, creators. We've heard that the comic book industry is quite insular. And, is it harder just by design for creators of color to kind of break in? When we look at the demographics, this is based off of a Kristen McLean's of MPD Bookscan's demographics of readers of comic books. This is based on a 72-person consumer panel from 2017. 69% of the panel were white comic readers, 12% Latino, 10% Black, 8% Asian. But when we go to Zippia.com, and this is from 2018, and unfortunately, as try as I might, I could not figure out exactly how they came up with these numbers. But the demographics, as far as the creators, do not exactly line up with those. Whites are overrepresented at 80% of writers. Latinos, 7%, Black, 5%, and Asian, 4%. So you would imagine the reader demographics are the people that are interested, at least in the hobby. You would hope that a certain number of those would be interested in the profession itself. And it doesn't quite appear to be matching up. And I wanted to reach out to you. You obviously worked at Milestone as an assistant editor. You're starting up your own comic book company called Animated Concepts, and you have a lot of connections within the industry. Is there a perception out there that it is harder for people of color to break in to the industry, and perhaps there's a reason, like mechanism in place to keep them out?
Okay, so that was a tough question. So based on you did a little bit of a tweak there by design.
Okay,
So
let's go with
but that's okay. But I'm gonna approach it from by design. But I like what you asked. If that was the perception, so I would say that it's a little bit of a mixed bag. That the answer is yes. It's harder to, I would say, maybe make it in comics as a Black comic book creator or even a person of color. It's harder to make it because the expectations may be higher, or and in some cases maybe more unfair. But after talking to a few professionals about it, some who are current and some who have not been in the business for a bit, I would say if you had to really boil it down, it's like that's kind of the way the business works for everybody. So as one person said to me, the hard thing about this was he spoke to two editors when he was first, one comic book professional I talked to who was Black. And this was back in '96 when he talked to two professionals. And I'm going to say there were two editors from DC. So he said that he spoke to one of the editors. And the first editor basically told him after he expressed his interest about becoming a writer in the comic book industry, he says, you know what, you'll never make it. It's too hard. The odds are against you. And basically it's pretty much kick rocks. Don't bother, don't waste your time. Then I'm going to name another person because the sponsors a lot more favorable, which is Paul Levitz. So when he went to Paul Levitz and basically expressed his interest in joining the comic book industry, it was a totally different response. It was just like, hey, look, whatever I can do for you, give me a call. It's like, yeah, this might be a little more difficult, but basically, as that person put it, he rolled out the red carpet for him in terms of him being, if he really wanted to be a writer in the industry, whatever he could do to help. So that's the difficulty of this. The difficulty of this is that person's what he said to me, his takeaway was that, yeah, there may be people in the industry who are, let's say, not trying to help people of color or Black creators get into the industry, but basically all you can do is stay away from them. Just stay away from those people. The problem is you just don't know who those people are. So, and that's the trick. So a lot of times, if you're finding that certain creators are being in terms of ethnicity, are being overrepresented in the industry, it's hard to tell if that's by design or if that's basically just the way it is because of the history of the industry in general. So, I mean, do we go back to somebody like Jack Kirby and do we say, was it hard for him to break into comics? Was it hard for him to basically stay in comics to a certain extent? I mean, there's a whole lot of dynamics that go into that. But to say that it's by design, I think that's a little bit hard to nail down. So I'll start with that. I'll put that out there to begin with.
It certainly is, because you'd have to, what mechanisms are actually in place to, to warrant somebody a greater opportunity, based on their skin color. We do know, and I imagine you know this better than I, or the way that it's been explained to me is the way that you get into comics, like you were talking about, is through relationships. We just had a discussion about mentorship on the channel over the weekend. And it sounds like Paul Levitz was more than willing to be a mentor to that young creator that was looking to break in, help them, provide his experience, maybe share a connection or two and open some doors with them. Mm-hmm. From what I'm told, for the most part, that's through editors. Obviously, Paul Levitz ends up being the editor-in-chief of DC. That's a pretty high-profile gig. So it happens to be through editors. So could it be that there just aren't enough black editors or minority editors in the industry?
I mean, that could be. I would say, yeah. So, in other words, I would say probably pre-1990s. There was a definite way that you got into I think there was a different way you got to the industry, and that was you either went to a con and you forged a relationship with an editor to get them to look at your work and hopefully get a gig. Or, and I think this is in most occupations, you kind of you start in the mail room, if you will. So you start sweeping the floors at DC, or you get some kind of other position at a publishing company that, because now you're in proximity, and it's literally
in
down the hallway
room or something.
There you go. It's or you could even be the VP of marketing, as one guy was telling me. That's what he was. He got one story writing on X-Force because basically he was right down the hall and they knew he had an interest in this. Hey, try this one out. That's what it is. So for me, that was kind of the way I got into the industry with Milestone. Was I knew, okay, let me work in the editorial department. So of course, that's where the jobs get handed out. But the idea is to either be a staff member at the company already or to forge a relationship with an editor. And up until the 90s, that was the way that it was done. It seemed as though there was a little bit of a shift after the 90s, after the whole comic book crash, where now, and because I remember actually buying a book about this, now the way to get into the industry was you kind of already had to be a known quantity, a proven quantity in a related industry. So in other words, if you were a top 10 New York Times best-selling author, that would get you a writing gig a lot quicker than if you worked at the company or you had a relationship with an editor.
Wizard Magazine, that became into the industry?
Into the industry. If you're Ta-Nehisi Coates and you're known for, all the stuff on reparations, and you become sort of like a black thought leader, because now you end up getting comic gigs because, if nothing else, it's easy PR. But it's primarily the way to get into is relationships. If there aren't enough black editors and I would say this, there aren't enough black editors to basically get more creators of color into the industry, that's a problem. But I would even say you could argue there's a deeper problem than that, is that sometimes what happens is when you get, and I'm going to use black people as an example because I know this is a little bit of an unspoken of phenomenon. When you get them into a position where basically they have decision-making authority, some of them get gun shy. It's almost like, man, I got in here and I'm not trying to rock the boat. And if they don't feel confident in the qualifications or the skill levels of other creators like themselves, they will just tend to do what their other colleagues will do and hire from that same pool base. So it's kind of like we had this discussion. We kind of touched this on the aficionados at one point, where it was like, well, if so and so gets hired, then he brings his Rolodex along with him. And whoever's on his Rolodex, that's who you're going to start seeing working at Marvel or DC. It happens with creators. I've heard, of this. I think everybody else knows that there's the Friends of Bendis Club, or the friends of Brubaker. If Bendis gets hired at DC, you can almost notch off who's going to start getting assignments over at DC. And I think what happens with Black creators, if they end up in that position, or if they end up in that position editorially, they don't feel, for reasons real or imagined, that they can operate with that same kind of freedom, if you will. But
it's interesting.
But that's it.
I have a somewhat relevant story here. When I was working in Alaska, I was working in this unit, and one of the leaders there, she was a single mother. She'd been a single mother since she was like 19. She was well into her career, about to get into retirement age, and she was in a very senior position. And if you were a single mother within that unit, you were held to a different standard, meaning she was not going to cut you any slack. You had to be as hard-nosed and go almost through everything that she felt that she had gone through to even be considered for like a bump up as far as your job, give you some more opportunities. And if you were a married woman that had children, you got treated differently. If you'd be treated the same as me, but if you were specifically from her situation, which she felt that she had to overcome, you had to overcome it like she did. It was crazy.
And that gets drilled now. And again, I'll just speak as a young Black man. That gets drilled into your head almost the minute you step out into society. So, like, I went away to school to a place called Deerfield Academy, and I was part of the Better Chance program. And that was the mantra, man. It was like, you guys have to realize something. You guys have to work 3 times as harder as the white students there. And it's always tied to, because when you're there, you have to represent in such a way that you're not giving the institution or the culture or the society, if you will, an excuse to close the door behind you. So you're always not only
you're an ambassador.
Having to live up, you're an ambassador. You're not only having to live up to your own personal standard, you're sort of carrying on the banner from the people who came before you, and you're setting and keeping the bar up for those who are coming behind you. And it's something that's very self-imposed. It's very self-imposed. It's like, if I had to say, our white counterparts, I don't think they necessarily get that kind of pressure, other than it's like, your old man was like, 5-time All-Star quarterback. And then if you're walking into that thing, like sort of a legacy thing, okay, maybe. But usually the legacy thing more plays to your advantage in terms of getting a pass, if you will, or at least more tacit support and encouragement than it does in the sense that, man, if you don't get this right, it's over for everybody. The whole race goes down. The whole group goes down if you mess up or do things a certain way. And to give an example of that, when I was at Deerfield Academy, it was one of my friends, one of my best friends. He had asked me a question during our senior year, where basically there were, over the 4 years that I was there, I would probably say 3 Black students who either one got expelled for disciplinary stuff, and 2 just ended up not coming back to finish. So he asked me the question. He says, "Well, Gevian, why does it seem like the Black students have a harder time, finishing up, getting through the school 4 years than everybody else?" And I said, "Well, the only problem I have with your question is then what about me? And what about so-and-so? And what about so-and-so over there? And so-and-so over there?" Because there was at least, if I'm not exaggerating, at least 20 Black students who came up in our class together, and basically probably 60 plus overall. And it's like, yeah, but they're all making it, and we're all finishing up, and we're all graduating. Why am I being judged and looked at through the lens of 3 guys who are outliers? 3 guys who, for all intents and purposes, are outliers. And I think that's what you're dealing with. I think that's why you used an excellent word in your original question, which is perception. What is the perception? Because some of those demographics that you sent me, as we were talking before the break, I said, yeah, the white guys, the white folk are overrepresented. There's no question about that. And it seems like male, female, gender isn't the issue. Because I think we were looking like almost like a 60-40 split or something like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it could be tighter, but it's not like a huge gap. But when it came to the pay, though, it was like the Asian comic writers were getting paid
destroying
at least
everybody.
A quarter more. Yeah, they were destroying everybody. And I started going, okay, well, you guys got this locked up at 80%, so either you guys are terrible negotiators, or these Asians know what they're doing, or Jim Lee's wrecking the curve. So it's like, it is. I find it fascinating how sometimes how we perceive ourselves in a situation, we actually, without kind of like taking a real hard, cold look at it, and I want to say like a numbers look at it or statistical look at it, we end up almost making something that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Even like with the gender gap that they presented there, where basically I looked at the writers and the artists, and the gender gap between between male and female was about $4,000 for both professionals. And I'm like, they're doing the same job. How does that happen when you're doing the exact same job? And it's like, I think a lot of that is it that the women don't know that this is how much a male gets paid to do a comic book page? Because I'm pretty sure at this point, if it's not common knowledge, you can find that fairly easily. How is it that you have a pay gap at all, much less one of $4,000? So I think perception plays a big role in it, and I think also part of it is maybe it's like not knowing your own self-worth, and sometimes it could be just a thing of like just not knowing how things work. That could be it. And I'm not discounting that, and this is not in any way meant to discount that there isn't racism at work, there isn't sexism at work, classism, if you will. Definitely this thing that's new for me, political ideology. I'm not saying that those things aren't at work, because I've heard horror stories in all four of those categories. But I'm also saying there's also room for it. Both can be true, that while those things are going on, that some of it just may be some people just don't know how to ask for more money, or don't know how to ask for work the right way, don't understand how to break into the business. Because you know, as one of the guys I was talking to saying, it's like, yeah, you could say that, oh yeah, it's because they're all racist, but then how do you explain those 5 guys over there? It's like, how do you explain it? And then when you say that, oh, is it harder for people of color to make it in the comic book business? Well, apparently not if you get in, because if you're Asian, you making money, son, you definitely clearing everybody else. So yeah, it's I think we have to ask more questions about this, and I think maybe do some deeper dives, because I think there are going to be, because it's a hard thing to prove when it comes to the racism, sexism, and that stuff. It's like unless somebody comes out and says, yeah, I did it because I didn't pay him or give him the job because he was black. And that's like,
there's
okay,
an email or a DM or a phone conversation.
Exactly, or a tweet or something that at least indicates that. But it's like, unless you got a smoking gun, it's perfectly feasible that because the comic book business sucks in general, it's not an easy industry to break into in general. That just might not be an easy industry to break into. And using an example of, there was this, I sent you a video, but I know you said you were busy today, about this University of North Carolina tenure controversy about one of the project 1619 project contributors, Nicole Hannah-Jones. And that whole thing of like, if nothing else, people are saying that even if there were reasons because of an association with the 1619 project, and that has some controversies about it in terms of how accurate it was, in terms of the project itself and some of the contributions made, that the way the tenure process was carried out was so unprecedented that you can't discount the fact that did her race play into it at some point. And then for her answer to it was just simply like, you know what? I'm not responsible for, helping you trying to figure out how to solve your racist policies over the years. I'll just go over to Howard. It takes tenure over there. So sometimes that becomes a thing. If you have people of color who basically like, yeah, you know what? I don't need to do all this to break in. I'll just go start my own thing or do something someplace else. So that's what they'll do. I mean, in terms of like with animated concepts, it's like my thing wasn't so much that, oh, I couldn't break into the industry or couldn't find a way in. I mean, that wasn't a problem for me personally. It was, I had connections, I had relationships. The way I broke into industry was that a guy who worked at Continuity Studios, Neil Adams Studios, worked with my dad. And my dad said to him, my son's interested in comics. So I basically was hanging out at his studio or hanging out at Continuity. And that was my entree into the industry, developed some relationship, and then answering a classified ad in the back of a Milestone Media comic. That it wasn't like, oh man, how do I get in? Why I ended up not going into the industry full time, and eventually now, many years later, doing animated concepts, is because the comic book market crashed. And when I sent my resumes out, it wasn't that people weren't interested. I always tell the story. Yeah, there's just no jobs. Marvel. It was a guy from Marvel. I'm telling you, it sounded like he was calling from under his desk, like they were shredding documents at Enron. He was like, bro, he was just like, man, it's like, it's a really great resume. I just wish you just had sent this at a different time, because we worried about our jobs. And after that, I knew I wasn't going into the industry after that. Even though things got better afterwards, because of the shift in terms of how you broke into the industry after that, where it really became more now you had to basically self-publish in order to even get looked at, especially from a writing point of view. It's like, if I'm gonna spend the money to basically start my own company, not just start my own company. I'm not gonna basically do a $20,000 resume just to get a job.
Take a lot of risk just for an opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. Just for an opportunity to maybe get a job. So
Gevian, I did want to ask you something. You kind of hinted at it earlier. It's something that I, when I was in Colorado Springs, I met this young lady. She was an actress, and she lamented. She was a black actress, and she lamented the fact that she would get passed over for all these opportunities because she was simply an actress. She said if you wanted to be a black actress, you had to be a musician in order to actually get a break, that you got to cut the line. And you mentioned something earlier about a Ta-Nehisi Coates. We see John Ridley, Reggie Hudlin. It feels like maybe it's a little bit harder these days because they're, importing talent from other places that seem to be more esteemed mediums that they hope will translate better into comics rather than going for, homegrown, black talent or Asian talent. They're kind of going out there and trying to find people that maybe can come over and bring some like name cachet with them.
Oh no, absolutely, and that came with my conversation as well. That's definitely a dynamic at play. Is that there's this idea that you get someone who has a name cachet who comes in, doesn't mean they know anything about comics. They weren't a fan of them, didn't grow up with it. Not really familiar with it, and as we can all tell from as we all know from some of the work, you can tell that with the exception, with a couple of exceptions, like I would say probably Eve Ewing, because we talked about that before, she might be one of them. They really don't do well at it, and you can tell.
Jeff Thorne would be another one. His Green Lantern
one. That's true.
Is good.
Jeff Thorne's another one that they're basically. And I think that would, to me, if I was,
he's a big fan though. He's been
he's a fan
his whole life.
No, he's a fan, and I think, and the guys that I know who know him, they know that first of all, he's an excellent storyteller. That's the first thing. I can't speak to his fandom, but if he's a fan, it shows. But the thing is that I think just to his storytelling alone, because Jeffrey Thorne has been involved with a lot of projects, in terms of writing, that he knows how to tell a story, and if you can just get the general idea of how comic book writing works, which is just understand that it is a genre, particularly a superhero genre, and how to make it work from there, then somebody who is a very good storyteller should be able to adapt easily. But I think a lot of that name cachet stuff was born out of, because I don't know how old your audience is, or people remember, is that, Marvel going bankrupt was a big freaking kind of deal. It was like people were looking around like, is there going to be a comic book industry in like 5 years? And so I think the normal panic and self-depreciation that normally was in the comic book industry got exponentially multiplied after the 90s. So it just became like, everything's got to be a sure bet. Everything's got to be something I can push. We can't really take a risk on unknowns, because it's like, the circulation took a hit. Now we got people involved, and we got to make more money, and you got the short-term return of investment thing going on. It just took on a different vibe. So it's even, it's just a different environment now. I think it's going to be harder by that metric, by that dynamic, for anyone to break into the industry, and to make it in the industry. I mean, with those stats, when you look at I believe it was the comic book writing. I think it was the comic book writing stats. No, I'm sorry, it was the comic book artist stats. The fact that I think it was like, I want to say like 80% of them only lasted about a year in the industry, or something along those lines. And so basically you were looking at about another 10% who were in there for like 1 to 2 years, and then another 10% who basically have been in the industry for 11 years or more. So it's kind of like, if you're going to play,
so
like
they're churning you through, they're seeing who catches.
Yeah.
And then
they're seeing who catches.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like a kid saying, I'm going to go play in the NBA. It's like, dude, you realize like only 1% of people who ever play basketball make it into the NBA. It's a rarefied environment. And then on top of that, then you talk about even that 1% who make it, how many of them are successful? Like, how many of them have a really long career or have an extraordinary career? That number then shrinks by that much. And we've all heard the horror stories of people who are working in comics regularly How basically, they get paid in spam and cheese, and they're just doing
I've been
this for the
told
love
the
of
rates
it,
are
dude.
going down, as inflation is going up, they're cutting rates, and that's why you've seen a
Oh.
lot of the high price veteran talent
Mhm.
moving on, to
I'm
their own
surprised they hung
projects.
out. I'm surprised they hung out this long. When I was doing my research for animated concepts in terms of like what I could offer in terms of pay, I was surprised by how close what I wanted to offer was not only the current industry standard, it was
Might be a little
also
above.
yeah, it might be a little above. Exactly. I was like, oh, I may be offering too much here, but it was actually in line with proposed rates for a comic book creators union back in the 70s. That's how little the pay has moved up. So of course you can't do it based on you can't say, oh, what Jim Lee gets. No, we ain't talking about Jim Lee, bro. We talking about on average. The guy who's not Jim Lee, what is he getting paid? It's like, yeah, dude, why would anybody stick around with this after a year? And there's plenty of, this is what I do. There's plenty of story of guys. They just go on to animation. They go on to something else. I know you was not a big fan, but I love Chuck Patton. But I can understand why Chuck Patton made a break for Hollywood.
Video games, animation,
video games. It's like, and then the guys who do make it big or who are popular, we all dread it because we know it's only time before they just only do covers. So it's kind of like the WWE. WWE, it's like you're part-timer now. It's just like, oh, he hit big. Maybe you get 2 years out of them, and then all of a sudden they can't do a regular ongoing to save their lives. So, yeah.
Yeah. It becomes pretty disappointing in those networks. But there's definitely, a feeling that something's in there. You don't know necessarily that it's like it's something that's a mechanism put in place. But there's something that's keeping disproportionate rates compared to readership and the people actually writing the comics. We can acknowledge that.
But we can acknowledge that if we're looking at basically, like they said, those demographics that are out there in terms of the breakdown by ethnic group in terms of occupation. But I think sometimes what the problem with that is, and this is a phrase that my brother introduced me to recently when it comes to conflict resolution. He says at some point you got to be specific though. So to say that, okay, because there's only 10% of the creators make up comic book writers who are black, or to say that because it's 80% and white writers are overrepresented, that automatically, that means there's a mechanism there that's racist, that's designed to keep them from doing X, Y, and Z. You have to be a little bit more specific than that. Because if the very least, like you said, you don't know how they're sourcing these numbers, you at the very least just say, okay, well, for those who are there right now, why do you say that it's specific? And then they're going to have to start naming names, or at least naming situations. And unless you're then talking to the person that they dealt with to say, well, so and so over here said that this is when they talked to you about this is why they didn't get the job, and this is why they felt like they didn't get the job. And they're like, well, I just didn't give them the job because their punctuation was bad. And even if it was, like we said this earlier, even if it was like, nah, I just don't hire black folk or Asian folk, something like that, you're never going to get that out of somebody unless there's some smoking gun proof someplace else. So it's almost like, and I think it's like, so what can you do about it? Because I discovered this new phrase. I discovered this new phrase called Afro-pessimism, which is like, as it seems to be defined is that you have people who sit around and all they do is basically they describe the water while people are drowning. So it's like that's the essence of it. You just offer no solutions. And the only thing I can say is that I would say to a man, every man and woman, every person I talked to who was a person of color as a comic book creator, and I would even say in the past, because I didn't reach out to him for this particular thing, but even white comic book creators I've talked to, the answer to it is you got to grind to get better at your craft. You have to make your own opportunities. So that means that if people are seeing a problem with the underrepresentation of people of color in the comics, then you got to do one or two things. So I'll use myself as an example first. You start your own thing, you build your own company, and then you create that representation that if you perceive that to be the case wasn't there before for whatever reason. But I think the second one is going to be the more effective solution to it is I think it actually, at least right now, addresses what I think is really going on in the industry, is that just have to be really, really good. You do have to be 3 times as better as someone else. And I use 2 examples for that. So one was, I think it was Peter David, who said one time that someone said that, you know what, writing this story over here in television, that's easy. I could do that. He's like, yeah, you're gonna have to do at least 3 times as better than that before they even take a look at your script, which says hire you. You have to give them a reason not to deny you. The second example of that was, I think, if I get his name wrong, forgive me, everyone, Mike Allred, who's the creator of Madman. And he was trying to get work at DC at Vertigo with Karen Berger. And if I remember the story correctly, he would submit his stuff. He's done Madman. It's a successful independent comic. And she turned him down. I think she turned him down a couple of times. She was just like, and he didn't give the reasons for why she turned him down in terms of his work. But his thing was, he was determined that he was going to keep plugging at it until she basically gave him a gig. And I think he ended up getting the gig. Definitely, I think one of the Sandman characters, Steph, he ended up getting a gig. He just kept plugging away at it until she could not say no. Took all the notes, all that, and did that. So the problem with the solution is, it's really coming down to what is your perception of the problem. If your perception of the problem is just not enough Black creators, then honestly, if you come into some money, or if you save up enough of your money, you just start your company and you just basically hire everybody who looks like you or who doesn't look like the overrepresented group. Now, of course, because I know your audience and that there's a problem with that. I said, to me, affirmative action is nice. It's on its way out the door now. It's nice. But affirmative action, at least from my perception, was never meant to, we've got 10 spots, let's just fill them with whatever Black person, Asian person, or Hispanic person that comes along. It was like, no, affirmative action, at least I perceived it as being, is that when you would have people of color who would perform at a certain level, but were not getting entry into the schools or the jobs in the first place. So that's something that basically people are going to have to self-regulate if they're going to operate like that. It's like, bro, just don't give a job to somebody just because of the color of their skin. In some cases, just because they're your buddy, because that's a whole nother thing, which is called cronyism.
Well, and you also set people up for failure, which I think you've seen. I've certainly seen it where some of these editors, like, they're recognizing the problem. What is perceived as a problem, they want to fix it. So they just try to wish a comic writer into existence. They put them on this project, and you're like, you can tell they've never written a comic book before. He's like, or at the very least, they don't get it. They don't. If they have, they still don't get it. And where's the editor of this? There's no improvement.
Well, and part
so
of this
is what I want to talk about, Jermaine. I don't want to.
Go ahead. Yeah.
This is an anecdote that I saw that I thought was effective. You know who Dana White is?
Yes, I do.
The president of the UFC. There was a time where all the UFC fighters seemingly were from Brazil, America, and then they had a few Japanese fighters. They weren't getting any homegrown European talent. They wanted to move into the European audience. They said, well, if we want to be main eventing in Europe, we're going to need European fighters. So what they did was they created the Ultimate Fighter, where they took basically the best British talent that they could get their hands on. They created they took 2 of them at first. They ended up doing an entire season afterwards. But it was Michael Bisping. It was another fighter. And they created the Ultimate Fighter to see if they could get these guys to hit big there. After Michael Bisping ends up winning the Ultimate Fighter, which was by design. They wanted him to win it because he was the British guy. They went and they main evented a stadium show there. Kind of small, but it was a big deal. It was the first UFC event there, headlined by a British fighter. In the audience, I believe, was a young Conor McGregor, who 7 years later would rise to prominence and become the biggest pay-per-view seller in their entire company, who was not a trained mixed martial arts fighter at that time. But they realized, if we want to get fighters out of this area, if we want to cultivate talent, we have to go plant seeds. We have to go invest in that community, let them know that this is something they should be able to do. And next thing you know, you have multiple British champions now. You have a lot of British fighters, and you have a lot of European fighters that have sprung up out of this. It feels like a lot of times, maybe in the comic book industry, people will point to this as an issue, and I'll agree with it. These numbers, as far as the readership, you would expect the professional numbers to line up a little bit more. But nobody actually wants to go out there and plant the seeds and try and develop these talent from the ground up and have real, well-developed writers that are ready for these gigs when the opportunities present themselves. They almost, a lot of times, maybe in some cases they're trying to wish people into existence where they don't really have the talent. I think mentorship and going out into communities and investing in people when they're young and letting them know that being a comic writer or a comic artist is something that you can do when you're older. And these are the things that you're going to have to do. We'll find a mentor for you. We'll find some programs for you to develop your talents. And then you'll actually have the talents homegrown out of there. And then it'll be a system. Because you've got people that they're recognizing their neighbors have done something, and next thing you know, they're interested. But there's no investment. That's what I see.
Well, yeah, and the thing was that there was that kind of mentorship. Maybe there still is, but there definitely is a kind of mentorship back in the day. So when you look at a lot of the guys who ended up at Milestone, a lot of them came out of a program that Michael Davis, who was one of the founders of Milestone, used to run. It was clear. It was like
you guys talked about it when we were talking about Milestone. There were mentorship programs built in.
Exactly, they were mentorship programs. Now the difference, what you just described, and I think again that's why I think sometimes when we say is it harder for people of color to break into the industry, and I think it's hard for anyone. It's like the difference between what UFC does, what WWE does, with like the NXT program and all the different variations of it across the world, and what the comic book industry does is that the comic book industry doesn't do that. They don't do that with anything. They expect you to develop yourself. They expect you to find your own product. They expect you to, on your own dime, they expect you to promote their product for them. It's like, it's this whole, and I really feel, it has always been like that. Part of it is the history of the industry and how it came into being, but it's like the comic book industry has never been one that has had a lot of self-esteem to the point that they think that isn't even worth making that kind of investment just for their own sake. Because you're exactly right. Now, with me at Animated Concepts, we're going to be working on some podcasting and stuff. And I've got at least one kid who is an African-American, black kid who basically has a little bit of experience in iMovie editing and a little bit of experience at working Canva. And I said, look, kid, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you an opportunity. So there's going to be a lot of sweat equity here. You're going to get the opportunity to work on a whole bunch of stuff. I'll say the places where I can pay you, I'll pay you that. But the goal is to work with him to the point to get him connected with other people, pour into him, so that basically at some point he becomes my executive editor or whatever it is in terms of the Animated Concepts podcasting, and then to bring other people and other young people in the community underneath him to create that kind of team and that kind of environment where they can learn and then hopefully not only grow with us, but go into other companies in the industry and get that experience and go make that money. But that has to be intentional. That has to be intentional. So when we say like the design thing, I can't lay design on the comic book industry because that would be giving them too much credit. That would be giving them too much credit that they're actually thinking hard enough to say we want to block X amount of people out or do this. I can't give them that because there's nothing to indicate. And the entire time that I've been collecting comics and studying the business of comics, much less the history of comics, that these guys have been intentional about anything except for when Jeanette Kahn was there, and this led to the DC implosion at a point where they were doing $1 comics where they clearly were trying to basically work within the newsstand industry and figure out a way to maximize both the content and their distribution footprint to do that. Even with the direct market, which it was like, okay, it made sense at first, but then that laziness kicked in where it was just like, man, we're just making all this money off of this non-returnable product. Why even bother with the newsstand anymore? We barely making money anyway. And all the lack of forethought, all the lack of whatever that went along with that.
No understanding of your reach and the way that you're reducing it.
And you've got to create not only new creators to replace the ones that are eventually going to get old and go out the door, but even the new customers. It's just like New 52, because you guys did a little retrospective on that, was probably about the closest they came to doing that. But I have to admit, even with New 52, I kind of like lost confidence in the project the minute I realized they weren't doing two things. It was like, it was great that they were great on the product end, like refreshing the product, trying to get something new in there. They were, and the problem with that always was going to be, the artists that they were using, were they going to stay on it for at least 2 years to like build an audience? The second thing was the promotion, absolutely great. I sat in the AMC theater, saw a New 52 promotion, can't knock that. But what it was place and product. And price and place. It was like, no, they didn't do anything to create an affordable price point, and they weren't necessarily getting the New 52 in places outside of comic book shops. So I was like, yeah, they're not serious about this. So to your point, it's like when UFC, what they did was they saying, we want to get into this market, and we're going to put in the time and money without the guarantee of a return on investment, because anybody says, well, they wouldn't have done that if they didn't know. I'm going to say Dana White stepped out on a limb. He says, I want to get into this market. I got to invest in some people, put some money out there, and hopefully I'll see that return. And it paid off.
Hey,
it paid off.
He didn't know Michael Bisping was going to win. He was just hoping. Like, he was one of two guys that should have won. And he happened to
exactly. And he sure didn't see Conor McGregor coming. You can't say, "Oh, I knew we." You can't say that. So the thing
an Irishman that he can put in Boston and sell out the Garden.
Yeah, exactly. And the comic book industry has to do the same. Yeah, it has to do the same thing. And now one guy that I talked to, he said, "Now this is a subject when it comes to comic book industry, maybe we just don't want to talk about." And so I'll talk about it. That's why the show is called "It's Complicated." He says that maybe what they're just saying is that when you look at the demographics of the customer base, maybe it's not worth pouring all that time and energy into basically grooming African American creators or grooming Black creators when they only make up 10% of the audience base to begin with. Now that might be something that would fall under the by design thing. Now is that short-sighted thinking? Oh, absolutely. And you want to know why that's short-sighted thinking? Because what makes you think that number couldn't be 20, 30, or 40% if you actually made an effort to try to get into that market?
Yeah.
But the only way you're going to know that is that either somebody like me comes along, but it's going to take somebody like me with the scale that I can operate many years, unless I get a Turtles-like hit to kind of prove that out. Marvel and DC, rightfully, with all that Disney and who are they now? Who's DC owned by? The ownership changes so quick.
Warner Brothers. It's under
Warner Brothers, or whatever.
AT&T.
So
that was Warner Brothers Discovery. That's
exactly.
The merger. It's AT&T right now.
Yeah, exactly. And AT&T money that you will be able to convince somebody to basically say, hey, can we get X amount of dollars? Because we see that basically with the shifting demographics of the country, that basically if we're looking at whites who are overrepresented in the comic industry are going to make up the less of the national demographic going forward, now would be the time to start basically planting some seeds and building up a fan base or a customer base in these communities who are going to take over at some point, or at the very least be much more represented on a national basis. But they're out in the comic book industry, either having that discussion, and these guys are like, hell no, based on what they perceive to be the return on investment being based on current statistics, or they're not having that discussion at all. And if I was a betting man, if I had $1 million, I would put it on the ladder. And
I feel like most of the leadership are just like,
they're trying to get
what's
out
happening
the door
next week.
Exactly. So. Exactly. And that's what it is. There's never been an intentional push that has gone more than 18 months, if that. And I'm being generous when I say that. In 18 months in terms of, as captains of the industry, this is what Marvel and DC are going to do it. And we've had these discussions many times on aficionados, and I'm still going to stand by it. The problem, if I had to say the larger problem in the comic book industry is, just like you touched on with the UFC anecdote, it's the lack of leadership, the lack of vision by the current leaders in the industry. To me, I'm a big fan of Jeanette Kahn because I think she had and I might be wrong, I think she had a vision of where these books and stuff could go forward. Even Stan Lee to a certain point. Paul Levitz, I don't know him personally, and I'm not trying to get a job for him, and I'm only just throwing a spitball in terms of speculation. It just seemed like Paul Levitz was definitely the supreme corporate manager. Like, he knew exactly what he needed to do to satisfy both the comic book fan base at DC and to satisfy his corporate masters. And I would say he's done a lot to build the infrastructure of DC, particularly with the graphic novel bit. But I don't think he was trying to like not rock the boat, just keep the boat steady. But he wasn't trying to make no big turns with the ocean liner to kind of move the industry in a different direction. He saw the direct market for what it was, and he maximized it. But beyond that, what was the plan for, like, how do we break this out 10, 20, 30 years from now? And Marvel practically stumbled into theirs. I mean, whatever people want to say, this was a real vision. I'm like, it's like they just realized there were some people who are not comic guys who says, this is like 60 years of stuff. We know there are fans out here. Let's merchandise and license the hell out of it.
Well, I mean, Disney bought Marvel by design because they needed something to be their version of Disney princesses. They said superheroes.
Exactly. And they weren't wrong. They weren't wrong. Yep.
It absolutely worked. So we're kind of winding down here, Gervais. Had I think a productive conversation.
Oh yeah.
Is there anything short term that can be done to maybe get more representation of minority creators in comic books that they could do immediately? And do you think they'll start investing and maybe address these problems at the root rather than trying to wish people into existence, rather than having good, well-developed creators ready?
I'll say this. I think that based on the conversations I know I've had with you personally off the channel, and I think based on a lot of content that I've seen out there in terms of the world, I think they know dang well from the industry perspective what they need to do. Why they're not doing it, I think a lot of it has to do with their perception of comics and the business itself. So I'm going to leave that out of here. In terms of short term, I'm going to go with one of the second solutions that was offered before by many of the creators I spoke to, which I believe in myself. Those of you who are out there who want to be a part of this business, be a part of this business. I'm gonna quote Ralph. I'm gonna go to Ralph Bakshi on this, who was a well-known animator. There is too much technology, too many distribution channels out there right now that you can't go into your garage or your house in your room and put this stuff out there. And he was talking about animation. The means of production, the technological means of production, have caught up to a level and have become ubiquitous and available enough that we don't have to wait for Marvel and DC to make this industry all that we see it to be. The only thing that I will realistically say is holding all of us back is capital. But crowdfunding, I think, is a way that at least provides some means for those who really want to see the industry go forward, to start providing capital for people who have a real vision and real talent to do this. But honestly, I think it's like everybody who wants to be involved with this industry and they want to do it, stop looking to Marvel and DC to do it. I get it. It's a lot easier to do the work and get a paycheck from Marvel and DC and be able to provide for yourself, for your family, and whatever else. But honestly, that's a death spiral for me in terms of if we're trying to move the industry forward. There's a certain baseline to that, and that's all there is to it. But it's like you got to this is a DIY moment in terms of
there's so many resources out there.
It's going to move forward.
Via internet, YouTube, all these tutorials. I've got a whole comic writing class. It's like probably
exactly. It's
200 hours or 20 hours now just of comic writing tutorial.
Yeah, and the thing is, I also think it's something where, and I open this up freely. If you know how to get in touch with me on Twitter, you know how to get in touch with me. Look at me on Facebook. My name ain't hard to find. info@animatedconcepts.com. If you're just looking for advice how to do this, reach out, because I don't think the industry is going to grow unless there's like a real, I hate to use these kind of words, but I actually think this is actually appropriate at this point, a real movement to actually see this medium grow to be something that we all know is bigger than what it is right now. And there's nothing, and I'm not going to say that the comic book industry isn't healthy. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying Marvel ain't making money. I ain't saying DC ain't making money. What I'm saying is we all get the sense that it's still bigger than that and could be bigger than that if someone was intentional about it. And I'll close with this, because you use UFC. It's like, I remember UFC way back when, and I'm talking when Blockbuster was still
the guy with the one boxing glove.
Exactly. There you go. And it's like, exactly. You're like UFC, and there was a time when it was gone. You were like, oh, this ain't going nowhere. And now 20-something years later, are you serious? And it's like that's the kind of vision you're going to have if you want to see more comic book creators that look like who we all are in society. You have to have a vision that's beyond a short-term, 18-month or 5-year window. You got to swing for the fences, man. And the thing is that there's, like, as I'm working with Animated Concepts and I'm making new connections, relationships, we're talking about how we're going to roll these things out. There really isn't, if you can get, and I know some people this may be hard, if you can get 15, 20 grand together, it's like, and you get the right strategy that's scaled appropriately, you can make, if not a dent, you can make a difference. That's all I can say. Yep.
I do want to say thank you very much to Gevian Dargan for joining me here today. If we haven't been booted off YouTube, if everybody hasn't unsubscribed to the channel, which could happen, we will be back next week for It's Complicated. We'll talk about something else that is difficult to talk about that could get us in trouble. I really appreciate it.
And And if you guys have questions those hard questions you want to answer, if you want to see how hard you can get me thrown off YouTube, send it to Wes or send it to me. I'll keep an eye on the comments and we'll tackle them because I think these are important things to talk about. Like Wes and I, we talked about. I said my vision for this show is, if it's successful, is let's take this public discourse back one like and one heart at a time. And I think we'll have something special here.